Hey gang, using the promo code MTGMudsta, one word, all caps, will get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Flipside Gaming, Original Magic Art, and orders of singles at Multizone. If they don't have what you're looking for, you could check out TCG Player and use my affiliate link to help support the channel. Looking for a way to bling out your deck and not spend a fortune? Alter Sleaze can help with that, and you can help with the channel at the same time by using my affiliate link. Or, if you're looking to join the Goblin Gang, you can always support me through Patreon. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's game is another Gamebreaker gang, with Nick playing Vilis. He keeps a Swamp, Cavern of Souls, Bojuka Bog, Burnished Heart, Mimic Vat, Blood Artist, and Bitter Blossom. Max is playing Horde of Notions, keeping Temple Garden, Godless Shrine, Sheltered Thicket, Forbidden Orchard, Kindred Discovery, Wispmare, and a Timbermare. Ben is playing Daretti, keeping Spine of Ishsa, Blighted Gorge, Temple of the Spirit Dragon, Solemn Simulacrum, Mere Battlesphere, a Mimic Vat as well, and a Mountain. Malcolm is playing Rhys, keeping Elspeth Tyrael, 3 Plains, a Forest, Kozilek Butcher of Truth, and Parallel Lives. Malcolm wins the die roll and starts us off. Malcolm draws and plays a Forest. Nick plays a tap Bojuka Bog, exiling his own graveyard. Max plays a tap Sheltered Thicket, passing. Ben drops a tap Forgotten Cave. Malcolm plays a Plains and passes. Nick plays a Swamp and then pays 2 for Bitter Blossom. Max also plays a Swamp and pays 2 mana, but this is for a Fauna Shaman. Ben plays a Temple of the Spirit Dragon, passing. Malcolm plays another Plains and then taps 1 green for his commander. Nick loses 1 to the Blossom and gets a fairy token and draws. He plays a Swamp and casts a Burnished Heart, passing. Max plays a Temple Garden tapped and passes. Ben plays a Mountain and then casts Mimic Vat. Malcolm plays a second Forest and then taps 4 mana for Parallel Lives, which is apparently now absurdly expensive. Nick loses another 1 and makes a fairy token. He plays a Swamp for turn and goes at Malcolm with a Burnished Heart. He then passes, and Max uses the Fauna Shaman to discard a creature card and go and find one to put to hand. He finds my favorite, Risen Reef, and I move to his turn. Max draws and plays the Forbidden Orchard. He pays 3 and has Ben gain the token from tapping the Forbidden Orchard to cast Risen Reef. He looks at his top card, which isn't a land, and he puts it to hand. Max then evokes a Wispmare, which gets him a Risen Reef trigger as it enters, and he puts out a Steam Vents from the top of his library, and then blows up Malcolm's Parallel Lives. With the Wispmare then being sacrificed, Ben steals it away with the Mimic Vat trigger. Ben plays a Blighted Gorge and taps out for a Solemn Simulacrum. He then goes to find a basic, while Nick cracks his Burnished Heart to show him up and go and find 2. In retaliation, Ben steals the Burnished Heart to the Mimic Vat trigger. Malcolm plays a Plains and drops Divine Visitation, which makes Max really happy he blew up the Parallel Lives. Nick loses 1 to the Blossom and gets a fairy token. He then draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Demon. He then casts Jet Medallion and casts a Damnable Pact where X is 4, losing 4 and drawing 4. Max evokes a Muldrifter, layering his triggers to draw the 2 first and then resolve the Reef. He hits a land, which he puts to field tapped, and Ben then steals a Muldrifter with a Mimic Vat, putting back the Burnished Heart into Nick's graveyard. Max then plays a Spire Garden, which comes in untapped, and he casts Kadama's Reach. He has to give someone a token from tapping the orchard, and Ben gets it again. Ben plays a Mountain for turn and brings out Daretti. He then upticks the Walker, discarding 1 to draw 1. He then plays out Skull Clamp and clamps 1 of the tokens Max gave him to draw 2, and passes to Malcolm. Malcolm plays a Forest for turn and pays 5 for Elspeth Tyrael. He downticks her to make 3 soldier tokens, which are replaced by Angels with the Divine Visitation being out, and then just passes to Nick. Nick gets another fairy token and plays a Swamp. He plays a Sepulchral Primordial, who comes in and brings back the Wispmare from Max and the Battlesphere from Ben. With the Wispmare entering, Nick blows up Divine Visitation on Malcolm's side of the board, and he then passes to Max. Max discards a creature card to the Fauna Shaman in his main phase, and he goes to find a Maelstrom Wanderer. He then plays out an Exotic Orchard to go with his Forbidden one, and taps out to put Wanderer to the stack, and this time gives Malcolm a token now that the Visitation is gone. He gets 2 Cascades, hitting the Green Warden of Marasa first, and bringing back Cavalier of Gales, putting it to his hand. He then cascades into a Bramble Sovereign. He puts a land from the top of his library into play, and then the Wanderer enters, triggering the Reef again. This time the card goes to hand, and Max decides not to attack, passing to Ben. Ben plays a Darksteel Citadel, and casts Pia and Kieran. They come in and make him some Thopter tokens, and Ben then upticks Daretti, discarding 1 and drawing 1, and passes to Malcolm. Malcolm plays out a Seedborn Muse in his main phase, and once that's resolved, downticks Elspeth again at the cost of her loyalty tokens to make some more soldier tokens. He then passes, untapping with Nick. Nick loses another 1 and gets a fairy token on his upkeep to the Bitter Blossom. He then plays Thespian Stage and casts a Sangromancer. He then taps 3 for Mimic Vat, and at the end of turn, Malcolm uses Rhys's second ability to double the amount of tokens he has. Max draws and discards a creature card to the Fauna Shaman in his main phase. He goes and reveals Yerrick, putting it to hand. Max then plays a Godless Shrine, taking 2 so it comes in untapped, and then casts a Cavalier of Night. With it entering, he pays the 2 needed for the Bramble Sovereign trigger to make a token copy. He sacrifices the Risen Reef and the token version of the Cavalier to destroy the Sangromancer first, and then the Seedborn Muse. Because of order of priority, Nick gets to steal the Seedborn Muse before Ben does with the Mimic Vat. Also, because of how he sacrificed things, Max is then able to return the Risen Reef to the field as the token version of the Cavalier dies, and then pays to make a token copy of it with the Bramble Sovereign. This gives him a total of 5 Risen Reef triggers, with only one of them being a land, which is a command tower, coming into play tapped. Max then evokes an Ingot Chewer, blowing up Skull Clamp and getting 2 more Risen Reef triggers, both of which go to his hand. At the end of turn, Ben activates his Bat to make a Muldrifter, drawing 2 as it enters, and Nick also makes his Mimic Bat pop out of Seedborn Muse. Nick untaps with Ben, and Ben draws for turn. He plays a Mountain for turn, and then puts to stack Volcanic Offering, targeting Max's Cruel Turf and Bramble Sovereign. He has Nick pick the other targets, and Nick hits Command Tower, but also targets the Bramble Sovereign so as not to invoke the Wrath of Max. Ben then goes to combat, swinging the Muldrifter at Max, who takes 2. In his post-combat main phase, he downticks Daretti, swapping the Solemn for the Spine of Ish-Sa, exiling his own Solemn to the Mimic Vat trigger, and giving Max back the Muldrifter. The Spine then comes in and blows up Nick's Mimic Vat. Ben also draws 1 from the Solemn dying, and at the end of turn, Malcolm uses Rhys's ability to make an extra copy of each token creature he controls. Malcolm draws for turn, and goes at Nick with his Vigilance Angel tokens. Nick blocks what he can, but still gets hit and drops to 10, and Malcolm then passes turn. Nick loses a 10th of his life to make a token, and draws. He plays a Swamp and casts Dread Return, and brings back the Sangromancer. He then plays a Blood Artist, passing to Max. Max discards an Elemental in his main phase to the Fauna Shaman, which has Nick gaining some life from the Sangromancer, while Max goes to find a creature card to put to hand. He reveals Titania from his search, and then casts a Victimize. He sacrifices the Wanderer, bringing back 2 elementals into play tapped. It's a Timbermare and an Ingot Chewer. Max targets the Mimic Vat on Ben's side with the Chewer, which has Ben activating it to make a token copy of Solemn. The Solemn enters and goes to find him a land, and they then resolve the Timbermare trigger, tapping the whole board down of creatures. Max then resolves his 2 Risen Reef triggers, hitting a land both times, which has them both coming into play tapped. Max then plays out Titania once all that's done, and brings back the Gruul Turf, bouncing a land back to his hand. With Titania coming in, he gets another Risen Reef trigger, and it's not a land, so it goes to his hand. Ben plays a Buried Ruin as his land for turn, and downticks Daretti again, swapping the Spine of Ish-Sa for a Skull Clamp, which as the spine hits the yard, goes back to his hand. He then clamps a token, drawing 2, and recasts the spine from hand. It enters, blowing up one of Malcolm's angels, and Nick drains Malcolm for 1 with the Blood Artist. Ben then taps 2 for an Everflowing Chalice kicked once, and passes. Malcolm plays a Plains and activates Rhys in his main phase to make some blockers in case people have some kind of combat trick. Since Max tapped everything down with Timbermare, this leaves Nick wide open, and Malcolm goes swinging with most of the tokens at Nick and a few at Ben. Before damage, Nick casts Sudden Spoiling, which basically fogs the combat step for Malcolm. Ben takes advantage of this, and blocks one of the angel tokens with Pia and Nalar to take it out. This has Nick also draining Malcolm for 1 with the Blood Artist trigger, and Malcolm then passes turn. Nick loses 1 to Bitter Blossom as per usual, and draws for turn. Max says he can deal with Malcolm, provided that Nick no longer has the Blood Artist on the field. Nick isn't super keen on this, but is even less keen on getting beaten to death by angel tokens. This has him casting Vilis, and he goes at Max with the Blood Artist. Max blocks with Titania, and the artist dies, draining Malcolm for 1. Nick then passes. Max has an Echo trigger on his upkeep from the Timbermare and lets it die. He then replays the Exotic Orchard he bounced earlier, and discards a creature card to the Fauna Shaman to find another creature, which in this case is Cavalier of Dawn. Max then taps enough to cast it, and it enters, blowing up his own Ingot Chewer. We see this as just a clever way to fill up his graveyard further, as Max casts Living Death to swap the creatures on the board for the creatures in the yard. Responding to this, Nick activates Vilis 4 times, losing 8 life, drawing 8 cards, and putting the -1/-1 each time on his Sepulchral Primordial to take it out. Max also responds to this by tapping his creatures and mana to cast a Chord of Calling. He puts 5 into the X and goes into his library, and puts out a Cavalier of Thorns. With it entering, he mills his top 5 cards, putting a land into play. Nick also gains some life from the Sangromancer seeing a bunch of creatures going into his opponent's graveyards. The table then swaps stuff from the board for the graveyard, and Max has some on-death triggers. The Cavalier of Dawn returns the Panharmonicon to his hand, while the Cavalier of Night puts the Risen Reef. His stuff then enters, and he gets 2 triggers per since Yarick is out. He blows up the Bitter Blossom and Skull Clamp and the Jet Medallion, and then draws a bunch of cards from Muldrifter double triggers and the Cavalier of Gales triggers. Nick also gets to bring some stuff back, and brings back the Green Warden of Marasa and the Battlesphere with his Primordial triggers. The Warden puts back to hand his copy of Sudden Spoiling. Max also realizes he should have a few Risen Reef triggers, and hits a few lands from them. With nothing else, he passes to Ben. Ben plays a Radiant Fountain, gaining some life as it enters. He downticks Daretti, swapping the spine for Mimic Vat, and puts the spine back to hand as it hits the yard. He then plays out an Energy Chamber, and recasts the spine. It enters, blowing up Yarick, which he exiles to the vat. With Yarick dying, Nick drains Malcolm for 1 with the Blood Artist trigger. Malcolm plays a Plains, and casts Hornet Queen in his main phase. He gets some Insect tokens as she enters, and passes to Nick. Nick draws, and reanimates Vilis, which is the dream for this deck. This has him bringing back his commander from the graveyard to the field, and then losing 8, which Vilis sees. This has Nick then drawing 8 cards from Vilis' static ability. Nick feels like he hasn't lost enough life at this point, and pays the alternate cost of Snuff Out to take out Maelstrom Wanderer, losing 4, and drawing 4 from Vilis' static ability. He drains Max for 1 with the Artist. One of those cards must have been a Soul Ring, which he casts, and he then taps 1 black for a Bubbling Muck. This doubles what his swamps tap for, and he uses Vilis to take out the Risen Reef and Hell's Caretaker, draining Max for 2 and losing 4 and drawing 4. Nick then activates Vilis twice to take out 2 of Malcolm's tokens, losing 4 life and drawing 4 cards, and continues to drain Max with the Artist triggers. Nick then flashes back Dread Return by sacrificing 2 of the Mirror tokens and the Green Warden of Marasa to bring back the Sangromancer. With the Warden dying, Nick exiles it to return to hand Bubbling Muck, and drains Max 3 more times. He then recasts the Muck, and plays out Magus of the Coffers because big mana is best mana. Nick still has enough floating for Lightning Greaves, and he equips them onto the Magus once it resolves. He then activates it, because obviously, and floats even more black mana. He uses Vilis to take out another of Malcolm's tokens, losing 2, drawing 2, and drains Max for 1. plus gains some from the Sangromancer. He then plays out a Kuro Pit Lord, who is kinda demon BFFs with Vilis. I'm gonna save us all some time and some editing, because Nick starts to rip through his opponent's creatures with Kuro, gaining life and draining his opponents as they die, not to mention drawing most of his library with Vilis. He continues to do so until he hits a Psychosis Crawler, which is a pretty solid card considering how many cards he's drawn. He then pays 1 to cast an Elixir of Immortality, and targets a creature and then activates Kuro enough times to lose 22 life and draw 22 cards. This has the Crawler dealing 22 to each of his opponents, and at this point, Max gets taken out. Nick then cracks the Elixir, gaining 5, and shuffles his small graveyard into his even smaller library. He then pays 5 life to Kuro to take out Ben's remaining blocker, and he gives the Crawler the Greaves, swinging it at Malcolm, and swings whatever else he can at Ben. This is going to be more than enough to take Malcolm out, and Ben knows when he's done for, scooping it up to Nick. Game review time. So I think unfortunately for Malcolm, it seemed like all his deck drew was token making abilities, and although it did do pretty well early on, 1 Living Death was all it took to set him back. He probably would have loved to see a Skull Clamp or something similar to help him draw some other cards and maybe find some other ways to deal some damage. Speaking of dealing damage, considering how many elementals Max had at any given point, he didn't actually do all that much with them. I think this is unfortunately due to the result of him playing something like Timbermare, which in theory seems like a sweet card, but unfortunately every time it came into play, it hindered him as much as his opponents did. I think Ben showcased a pretty sweet mid-range Daretti deck, where he was swapping artifacts back and forth to get that value. He didn't run any stacks pieces, which is nice to see. Nick ran dangerously close to dying in this game, but I think that's really where Vilis tends to shine. It also didn't hurt that he had a ton of life gain from that Sangromancer on the turn that Living Death happened, and it basically set him up to have the perfect next turn once he drew into Kuro. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.